The First World War in the Middle East ended in 1918, but the end of one war was just the beginning of another. The Allied powers occupied parts of the Ottoman Empire, but cannot impose a peace because of Turkish resistance. In the post-war chaos, Greece will attempt to revive past glories, but the Greco-Turkish War will instead see the rise of modern Turkey and the end of Greater Greece. In late October 1918, the Armistice of Mudros ended the fighting between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire, but lasting peace was still a long way off in Asia Minor. British, French, and Italian troops occupied much of the empire, including the imperial capital of Constantinople, the seat of the now powerless Sultan Mehmed VI government. As the Allied governments discussed a future peace treaty in Paris in 1919, their differences were clear for all to see. The French wanted to secure their financial interests and their new mandates in Syria and Lebanon. The Italians wanted to extend their influence into Asia Minor, and the British hoped to keep their First World War gains and secure the Eastern Mediterranean route to British India. The United States had no appetite for involvement in the region other than sending humanitarian aid, despite President Wilson's hopes. The Greek government, led by Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos, saw the defeat of the Ottomans as a historic chance to gain territory and achieve at least some version of a Greater Greece, the Megali Idea. In May 1919, at the invitation of the Allies, Greek troops landed at the city of Smyrna and occupied a zone in Western Asia Minor. In light of the terrible violence and ethnic cleansing between Greeks and Turks during the Balkan Wars and the First World War, the move was a controversial one, including for the British General Staff. Greek occupation will create a source of continual unrest, possibly culminating in an organized attempt by the Turks to reconquer this territory. The very first day of the Greek army landings at Smyrna, Greek troops failed to establish full control, which led to violence that saw several hundred Turks killed. In the months that followed, atrocities committed by occupying Greek troops caused local Turks to form irregular groups that attacked Greek soldiers and villagers. This marked the beginning of the Greco-Turkish War, known as the Asia Minor Campaign in Greece and the Turkish War of Liberation in Turkey. So the Greeks had established themselves in and around Smyrna, and local Turkish resistance groups had organized in response. But in the Turkish Anatolian heartland, a political and military national movement was growing. The impotence of the Ottoman government and the violence at Smyrna caused many Turks to rally around a nationalist cause that wanted to expel European and Greek troops and create a Turkish state. One Turkish nationalist described the effect of the arrival of Greek troops. After I learned about the details of the Smyrna occupation, I hardly opened my mouth on any subject except when it concerned the sacred struggle which was to be. This movement coalesced around Mustafá Kemál Pasha, who had commanded Ottoman forces in the Italo-Turkish, Balkan, and First World Wars. He and other nationalist leaders established a national assembly, eventually based at Ankara. Kemal's goal was simple: to create a new Turkish state, the sovereignty and independence of which would be unreservedly recognized by the whole world. As Kemal's nationalists organized in the east, the Sultan's Grand Vizier Damad Ferid Pasha also tried to preserve the country's sovereignty in Paris, but the Allied Big Four did not react to his pleas. In fact, the Allies were having trouble deciding what would become of Asia Minor. Not only did they have clashing interests, they were also divided about what to do with Armenian and Kurdish hopes for independence, and were worried by the reports of Greek atrocities. An Allied commission compared the Greek occupation around Smyrna to an annexation and recommended ending it, but Venizelos defended his position. The Greek claims on Smyrna and the neighboring region were not only well known, but they had been officially formulated to the conference. In occupying Smyrna, Greece knew that if she was not yet legally, she was at least morally entitled to it. The situation in Asia Minor got even more unstable in 1920. From January, French and Armenian troops fought Turkish national forces around Marash, Urfa, and Antep, with Turkish fighters murdering 10,000 Armenians at Marash and Armenian units murdering smaller numbers of Turkish civilians in response. Ottoman elections saw Kemal's nationalists win representation in parliament, but the British arrested many of them and formalized the occupation of Constantinople. In April, the Allied powers finally agreed on the terms of the Treaty of Sèvres to formally end the war with the Ottoman Empire. Britain got most of what it wanted, including internationalization of the Straits and a guarantee of Armenian and Kurdish states. France and Italy were to gain spheres of influence in Anatolia and, more importantly, strong financial concessions. The Greeks were to gain the region of eastern Thrace, while Smyrna was to be administered by Greece but formally remain a part of Turkey. After 5 years, a referendum would decide on its final fate. Like the other peace treaties, the Ottomans would pay reparations and had to reduce their armed forces to 50,000 men and a handful of small boats. No air force was allowed. For Mustafa Kemal's nationalist movement, the treaty would be their worst nightmare if it was implemented. But in the summer of 1920, it was a political gift for their cause. More Turks rallied to Kemal, and the Allies did not have the military means or political will to impose the treaty by force. French Marshal Ferdinand Foch estimated they'd need 27 divisions to enforce it, and no one in Britain, France, or the US was ready to commit them. Athens insisted that the situation would calm down once the treaty had been signed, so the Allies gave permission to the Greeks to begin an offensive. On June 22nd, Greek units crossed out of their zone of occupation and advanced towards the Sea of Marmara, central Anatolia, and in eastern Thrace. Kemal was still in the early stages of creating a Turkish nationalist army, so Turkish troops mostly withdrew on a fighting retreat, although both sides accused the other of committing atrocities along the way. Greek troops captured Edirne, Iznik, and Uşak before the French and Italians called for a stop to the advance. The Greeks had two options: to concentrate on eastern Thrace or to try to crush Kemal in Anatolia. The military favored the Anatolian option, but Venizelos chose to wait in the hopes that the British would send more troops. But the British did not send more troops, and even though the Sultan's government reluctantly signed the Treaty of Sèvres in August, the reality on the ground looked nothing like the one envisioned on paper. By late 1920, the Turkish National Assembly's regular army had grown to 86,000 men, and the Greek army of Asia Minor had grown to 100,000 and still stood deep in Anatolia without a political solution in sight. The Turks even launched their first serious offensive along the Gediz River in October, and even though Greek forces stopped them, it was a sign of growing Turkish organization and skill. Kemal also took the offensive in the east against the Armenians and pushed them back onto the territory of the former Russian Empire, in fighting that saw widespread atrocities against civilians. At the same time, Greek political life had been badly split between the supporters of Venizelos and those of exiled King Constantine since the First World War. By this time in the Greco-Turkish War, the tensions within Greece deepened even further. The country had lost most of its allied support, was in an economic crisis, and in October, King Alexander was bitten by a monkey and died of the subsequent infection. This revived the schism between the Venizelists and royalist supporters of King Constantine. Venizelos was defeated in the elections that fall, and Constantine, who was disliked by the Allies for his pro-German stance in the First World War, returned to the throne of Greece in December 1920. Venizelos later reflected on his defeat. My mistake was that when the death of Alexander occurred, I failed to postpone the elections in order to negotiate with Constantine and the powers for the accession to the throne of the constitutional heir. This was my great, and you might say, unforgivable error. Because this solution, if it had been achieved, would have restored national unity. So by the end of 1920, the Greek army was deep in Anatolia, and Turkish resistance was organizing around Kemal. The leaders of an unstable Greece, dependent on vanishing Allied support, were getting more desperate. The political situation continued to spiral for Greece and improve for the Turkish nationalists in early 1921. The Turkish assembly passed a new constitution, condemned the Sultan's government in Constantinople, and signed a treaty with Bolshevik Russia in March, which stabilized the eastern border and provided more weapons shipments as well. The London Conference was supposed to find a diplomatic solution, but failed, and the violence on the ground continued. Greek reinforcements arrived in Anatolia, Venizelist officers were replaced with royalists, and General Anastasios Papoulas took command of the Greek army of Asia Minor. Greek strength in Anatolia grew to over 100,000 men, and with the new recruits came reports of plunder and violence against the local population in areas under Greek control. In April 1921, the Greek Governor-General of Smyrna admitted to a spike in violence against Turkish civilians, but the International Red Cross report was far more direct. Elements of the Greek army of occupation have been employed in the extermination of the Muslim population. Instead of being disarmed or broken up, the bands have been assisted in their activities and have collaborated hand in hand with regular troops. At the same time as Greeks were killing Turks in the west, in the Pontic region, Turkish bands led by Topal Osman killed 8,000 Greeks. One Greek resident recalled the atrocities. They stripped the children and threw them into wells. Then they threw stones on top of them. They filled the church, the schools, and the barns with the old people and set fire to them. Athens was desperate to bring the war to an end, but many felt that there was no chance of victory. Even Greek General Ioannis Metaxas, who was by now out of the army, bluntly said that the war could not be won. Still, Prime Minister Gounaris' government decided to break the deadlock and save the Treaty of Sèvres. The Greeks attacked at the Battle of Inonou in January, and although they executed a planned withdrawal after their advance, the Turks saw the battle as a defensive victory that boosted morale. In March, the Greeks attacked again, this time to capture important rail links near Kütahya. More than 60,000 Greek troops made good progress in the north and the south, where they captured the town of Afyon-Karahisar, but poor coordination and a Turkish counterattack pushed them back. The Second Battle of Inonou was another Turkish defensive victory. The next Greek attempt to break the stalemate began on July 10, 1921. By this time, the army of Asia Minor had grown to 200,000 troops, 4,000 machine guns, and 410 artillery pieces. The Turks had also reorganized their 122,000 men, 700 machine guns, and 160 artillery pieces under İsmet Pasha. This time, the Greeks tried to encircle and destroy the Turkish army near Kütahya. By the 20th, they had retaken Afyon-Karahisar, pushed the Turks across the river Sakarya, and occupied the towns of Kütahya and Eskişehir. The Turks counterattacked but failed to regain the lost ground. The Greeks had won a clear victory at the Battle of Kütahya-Eskişehir, but the army of Asia Minor had failed in its main objective of destroying the Turkish army. The battle had cost the Greeks about 8,000 men and the Turks about 30,000, although many of these had lost contact with their units and would fight another day. The Greek advance caused panic in Ankara, and the Council of Ministers ordered the government to evacuate. But Kemal and Fevzi Pasha declared that the army would stay and fight, and the assembly voted for the politicians to stay. The Greek army didn't have the strength to continue the offensive, but Greek command was unwilling to admit its failure and planned one last gamble at the Battle of Sakarya. British observer Arnold Toynbee felt that the Greeks had no chance. It was a crazy enterprise, for every rational objective had disappeared. The annihilation of the enemy, 3 times already that stroke had missed its aim. The occupation of his temporary capital, as if the loss of Ankara would break a Turkish morale which had survived the loss of Constantinople, or would prevent the Great National Assembly from resuming its activities elsewhere. Everything was against the invaders. The Greek plan was to distract Turkish forces near the river and then surround and destroy them. To achieve this goal, the Greeks had some 124,000 men, 684 machine guns, 2,085 light machine guns, and 296 artillery pieces. The offensive of 1921 had failed and Allied support for Greece was evaporating, and the Turkish nationalists and their army were growing stronger. Kemal was now ready to go over to the offensive once and for all. The winter of 1921-22 confirmed the swing in momentum in the war. The Turks grew stronger and more organized, and they signed another treaty with Bolshevik Russia to secure the eastern frontiers and even more weapons, and also continued to reform the army. Turkish commanders like Refet Pasha improved logistics and added assault battalions of troops partially trained based on German stormtrooper tactics, which Ottoman officers had learned in the First World War. At the same time, Turkish resources were stretched and they feared they could not sustain a lengthy war. Meanwhile, the Greek situation continued to get worse. The economy was in crisis, Allied support for Greece was limited to a few British cabinet ministers, and Greek leadership no longer had the political will or military means to hold the territory it had won with its hard-pressed army. Army logistics were catastrophic, as supply lines stretched 300 kilometers from Smyrna into the interior. In May 1922, General Papoulas resigned and was replaced by Lieutenant General Georgios Hatsanestes, who did little to change the dangerous position of the Greek formations in the exposed Afyon-Karahisar salient. Athens was so desperate to force a solution that in June it transferred Greek units from Anatolia to eastern Thrace to march on Constantinople, a move that the Allies simply blocked. The Turks felt that they had to strike before further Greek reinforcements arrived in Anatolia, and they launched the Great Offensive, or Büyük Taarruz, on August 26th. Their army now had 200,000 men, 2,900 machine guns, and 323 artillery pieces, as opposed to 218,000 Greeks with 4,400 machine guns and 418 artillery. The major Turkish advantage was cavalry, 5,300 horse to just 1,300 Greek sabres. The Turkish plan, designed by Kemal and İsmet Pasha, was for First Army to move behind the Afyon salient from the south, while Second Army supported the effort from the north. The cavalry would surround and destroy the Greeks, just as they had tried to do to the Turks in previous battles. Turkish artillery smashed the Greek lines, followed by an infantry assault hoping to imitate stormtroop tactical success. But the Greeks managed to prevent a Turkish breakthrough at first. The next day, though, Turkish troops captured the high ground at Erikmen, which made the whole Greek defense vulnerable to encirclement. General Hatsanestes' headquarters was 300 kilometers away in Smyrna, so he was not able to react to the threat in time to prevent disaster. Over the next several days, Greek units simply disintegrated in the confusion as the Turks tried to close the ring around them. On September 1st, Kemal ordered a full-on pursuit of the routed Greeks. The oppressive and arrogant army of the enemy has been defeated. Armies, the Mediterranean is your immediate objective. Forward! As the remnants of the army of Asia Minor fled west in disarray, Turkish units harassed and surrounded them piece by piece, taking thousands of prisoners. Surviving Greek units applied a scorched earth tactic, and tens of thousands of stragglers pillaged villages along the way, leaving a trail of death and destruction. Athens dismissed Hatsanestes, but it made little difference. The Greek navy evacuated its remaining forces, and on September 9, 1922, Turkish nationalist troops entered Smyrna. Greek and Armenian civilians were terrified that the Turks might commit atrocities, but Greek authorities urged them to stay. Regional Governor Aristides Stergiadis told civilians to stay put while telling the government officials to leave, since he feared that refugees might spark a revolution back in Greece. Better for them to stay here and be slaughtered by Kemal than for them to go to Athens and turn everything upside down. The Archbishop of Smyrna pleaded in vain with Venizelos to save the Christian community. Hellenism in Asia Minor, the Greek state, and the entire Greek nation are descending now to a hell from which no power will be able to raise them up and save them. It is a real question whether when Your Excellency reads this letter of mine, we shall still be alive. Turkish soldiers and civilians now took what they saw as revenge on Christians of Smyrna, despite the presence of Allied warships in the harbor. The day they arrived, Turkish officers under the orders of Nureddin Saklai Pasha delivered the Archbishop to a group of Turks who mutilated and killed him. 4 days later, Smyrna's Armenian quarter began to burn, and the flames quickly engulfed the Greek and European quarters until 50 to 75% of the city had been destroyed. Most Western and Greek historians argue the fires were either deliberately started or spread by Turkish troops, which many Turkish historians debate. In the orgy of violence and fire, an estimated 12 to 30,000 Christians were killed. Some of the refugees were eventually taken on board Allied ships. Many others threw themselves into the sea to escape the flames and the Turks and drowned. The Asia Minor catastrophe, as the Greeks called it, caused political chaos in Greece. On September 24th, Colonels Gonatas and Plastiras led a coup that deposed the government and King Constantine abdicated. The Venizelos returned to power and several royalists, including former Prime Minister Gounaris and General Chatsanestes, were executed. On October 11th, 1922, Greece and nationalist Turkey signed an armistice, which ended the fighting in the Greco-Turkish War. One of the conditions was that Greek soldiers and civilians had 2 weeks to leave eastern Thrace, causing a massive exodus witnessed by Toronto Daily Star reporter Ernest Hemingway. 20 miles of carts drawn by cows, bullocks, and muddy-flanked water buffalo, with exhausted, staggering men, women, and children, blankets over their heads, walking blindingly along in the rain beside their worldly goods. They are the last of the glory that was Greece. By the end of 1922, about 1.5 million Greeks had fled or been driven from Turkey. As Greece imploded, Turkish victory also provoked the Çanak crisis in Britain. As Turkish forces advanced towards Gallipoli and Constantinople, there was a risk of war between British occupying forces and the Turkish nationalists. Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill wanted to fight for the empire's gains in the First World War, and to prevent Britain losing prestige in its Muslim colonies by losing to a Muslim power. But France, the United States, Italy, the British press, British trade unions, and the rest of the British government were not willing to fight. As British and Turkish troops faced each other across the barbed wire in the neutral zone, Canada and Australia refused to send troops. The Conservative Party withdrew from the coalition government and Lloyd George resigned. The Conservatives then formed the 1922 Committee to make sure it never made the same mistake as Lloyd George when he became out of touch with the parliamentary rank and file. Soon after the crisis, the British and Turks signed an armistice, and Kemal's new government deposed the Sultan to make way for a new Turkish republic. Lasting peace was finally established with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which replaced the Treaty of Sèvres and confirmed the modern borders between Greece and Turkey. It also confirmed the population exchange that had largely taken place during the upheavals of the previous years. 1.2 million Thracian and Anatolian Orthodox Christians ended up in Greece, and 400,000 Balkan Muslims ended up in Turkey. Tens of thousands of civilians had also been killed as the cycle of revenge killings and ethnic cleansing continued from the Balkan and First World Wars. The Greco-Turkish War, or Turkish War of Liberation, was a deadly conflict on the battlefield as well. Turkish military losses were 13,000 killed and 35,000 wounded, while Greece suffered 23,000 dead, 50,000 wounded, and 35,000 prisoners. It was also, perhaps, the final phase of the long and bloody series of wars that followed the First World War. The long and ugly war between Greece and Turkey is just one of the conflicts that we think it's important to cover in our documentaries. We also made an epic documentary about the Battle of Berlin in 1945 called 16 Days in Berlin. It's 4.5 hours long, over 18 episodes, taking you through the battle day by day. It features original film footage from Soviet cameramen, never before seen photos of the battle, detailed maps and animations, and expert interviews with David Willey from the Tank Museum, Ian from Forgotten Weapons, and more. Unfortunately, we can't upload this series to YouTube because it shows the grim reality of the Second World War, and that would get us demonetized, or worse. So where can you watch 16 Days in Berlin in 4K resolution? On Nebula, a streaming service we built together with other creators and where we can upload documentaries without the fear of demonetization. Oh, and every new Great War and real-time history video is also on Nebula, earlier than on YouTube, and ad-free. We'd like to thank Konstantinos Travlos for his help with this episode. He's the editor of the book Salvation and Catastrophe, The Greek-Turkish War 1919-1922, and we use several articles in the book for this episode. If you want to order it for yourself, you can check out the link below. This is The Great War 2022, a production of Real-Time History and the only YouTube history channel with a clear advantage in sabers.
Stop.